Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am so excited you are here. Tonight's recording, and yes, I am saying tonight, depending on when you're listening, is because we have partnered with Abigail Johnston and an amazing panelist for our NBC webinar series. If you're not familiar with our NBC webinar series, every other Wednesday, we live stream our content on Facebook as well as YouTube, and Twitter. As part of our NBC webinar series, we dive into topics that aren't commonly talked about. Tonight, I'm so excited because we have two amazing guest authors on the panel tonight. We have Brenda Denzler and Elaine Schattner. They both are going to talk to us not only about their books and their writing experience, but their experience with breast cancer, their experience about advocacy, as well as medical PTSD, this idea that we are fatigued and exhausted and sometimes going into the hospital itself can be incredibly triggering for us. So all very important topics. Before we dive into today's content, I just want to make sure that you have all of the information and resources at your fingertips. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, please hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to subscribe. We send out newsletters and information every Monday. You can also head on over to survivingbreastcancer.org/events to participate in over 300 programs we run per year, absolutely free to our breast cancer community. These include support programs, support groups for metastatic, inflammatory breast cancer, all stages breast cancer, etc. We have Qigong, we have yoga, we have art therapy, we have expressive writing. I mean, the list really goes on. And my new favorite right now that I'm highlighting is our breast cancer book club, where we read books that have nothing to do with breast cancer. So it's all for you at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. I would be remiss to not give a shout out to all of our social media handles, so please hop on over to Instagram, survivingbreastcancer.org, all one word, to follow us there. And if you're interested in my personal life with my caregiver and partner in crime, William LaFerrier, you can follow us at Laura and Will on Instagram for some behind the scenes sneak peeks of what we do in the day in the life.
I'm walking in to get this treatment and I know that I'm going to be miserable afterwards. And I am voluntarily showing up for you to stick me with needles and give me substances that are going to make me miserable for the next couple of days. And I don't know that there is enough of acknowledgement of how much courage it takes to walk back into the battlefield, as you're talking about, to walk back into a place where you know is going to have a negative outcome.
When they get difficult patients, stop and think about what may have happened to them in previous medical encounters that might have affected how they're able to react now.
Welcome to the conversation.
And I am super excited to have two authors tonight to talk about their own experiences with breast cancer, as well as their efforts to take those experiences and educate and support and help the wider community. And so we'll get to some introductions in just a moment here. But I just wanted to set the stage. Not just that we have two breast cancer survivors here tonight to talk about their efforts, but most of us who have a breast cancer diagnosis, especially when it's metastatic, our lives change in pretty substantial ways. And what often is very significantly affected is our ability to have a career, our ability to work, our ability to potentially utilize the education that we were able to obtain. And that can be a really big change. In fact, that loss of purpose or that loss of meaning sometimes in life can be something that's really, really hard to deal with, especially for those of us who are diagnosed young and perhaps at the beginning or maybe mid-career versus some of our other sisters and brothers in the MBC community who might be closer to retirement. And so talking about purpose, talking about meaning, talking about how we are able to live and find purpose and meaning within the context of a terminal diagnosis is a subject that I believe is something that we should be talking about regularly, because how can we live full, fulfilled lives as human beings if we're not thinking about ourselves as whole human beings, not just cancer, not just work, not just family, but the whole human being. And so that's part of what I want to weave through our discussions tonight, is this idea of purpose and how other people are finding and pursuing that purpose even after a breast cancer diagnosis. So we're going to start with some introductions, and but I just wanted to set that stage that's what I'm thinking tonight, right? I'm thinking about purpose, and I'm thinking about how we use these really difficult experiences to pursue a purpose and find meaning, even while it might feel like it's a pretty big struggle. So I would love to have Elaine introduce herself first. If you would talk a little bit about yourself, Elaine, and your experiences with breast cancer, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me. Abigail, really, this is an important topic. And hi, everyone. So I'm a physician, among other things, and I've had a somewhat irregular career, in part due to breast cancer. So I was 42 at the time of my diagnosis, which was early stage, and that was in late 2002. So, and at the time I was working as an oncologist. I am trained as a blood and cancer specialist, and I did that for a long time. So I was 20 years into as a doctor, and really basically 25 years into medical training and work when I got my breast cancer diagnosis. And as an oncologist then, I knew that my condition was treatable. You know, I recognized very too well that people, you know, that metastatic disease is very serious, as can be early stage. But I was optimistic about it, and I worked through my chemotherapy. And I had bilateral mastectomy for reasons of other medical conditions. I have a really bad back. I have scoliosis. And at the time I was having trouble walking. And so the idea was to get weight off my chest on both sides. So we took care of two things. And then what happened was later on at work, I encountered a lot of problems. I had to have spine surgery, and I had to take some time off for that. I wore a body cast and all this stuff. And then I became depressed. And it was the depression ultimately that killed my medical career. And that was a shame. I mean, it was in the 2000s, and it was at a time when doctors were less open about mental health. And I was really sad about it. I still am. So anyway, I picked myself up and I went to journalism school. I went to Columbia, and I started writing about breast cancer and other health conditions. And I enjoyed that. And so I'm a physician who became a journalist, and in the context of a history of breast cancer, I decided to write a book about awareness and how people talk about it, sort of the non-medical aspects.
Thank you for talking so openly, though, about the mental health aspect of the diagnosis, because I think that's sometimes forgotten, even now in 2023, that there is that component, and working while you're dealing with all of those things, no matter what your profession, but especially in a high stress job, can just be impossible for some people, as you yourself experience. So thank you for being so vulnerable. Brenda, would you like to go next?
Thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about another mental health aspect of receiving medical care. In my case, it is medical PTSD. I was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer in 2009. And of course, I got on the internet immediately, found out that inflammatory has about a 40 to 50% 5-year survival rate. I immediately got in touch with my primary care provider. She referred me on to the breast clinic at the local hospital, and the rest is kind of history. I was terrified. I got my diagnosis on June 30th at about 3:45 in the afternoon. Funny how some things you just remember. Within 2 days, the mental health piece of this erupted for me. I found myself terrified, just beyond reason, beyond anything. And I realized that it wasn't just the cancer. The cancer, I felt like I'll deal with this. I've got to deal with this. I can handle this. It was the doctors. The whole medical system terrified me. So when I went through breast cancer treatment, I was fighting 2 battles. One was the battle to just try to live, just to beat the cancer. And the other was the mental health piece. My doctors, I kept trying to explain to my doctors why I was behaving so squirrely, much more extremely than most of their cancer patients in their experience. And I tried to explain that I was terrified of them. The first clue for the night, do not go to your doctor and say, you may as well know that I am terrified of you. They tend not to take that well. I was struggling very hard to understand why I was so terrified and to manage that terror and to try to get my healthcare team to help me manage it. They had a very difficult time understanding that I was this terrified. It just seemed irrational to them. And indeed, I mean, a lot of terror has a large irrational component. But they couldn't understand it. And in the end, they ended up making everything worse. By the grace of God and good medicine, I have been in remission for 14 years. I have doubts. I'll have my yearly checkup soon, and I have some doubts about things. But at this point in time, I've learned to be a little bit more chill about that than I used to be. We'll approach that when I have my appointment. No need to rush. But I've also spent most of that time trying to figure out why do I feel like this and what can I do and how can I get my healthcare providers to understand these feelings and to understand how to work with a patient who presents like I did and how to not make everything worse or how not to induce treatment-related medical trauma in a patient, that previously had none. So that's kind of been my journey, is to try to figure out the cancer and what does it mean and am I going to live, and trying to deal with having to work with the healthcare system and the people within it.
Thank you for that, Brenda. We talk a lot about how no one comes to cancer, and specifically metastatic breast cancer, a blank slate, right? We come with all of our experiences, whether it's medical or not. We come with trauma, and all of us have experienced some amount of trauma in interfacing with the medical system. And so thank you for your vulnerability in writing the book that you wrote, but also being willing to talk about how triggered you were at various points in your cancer experience. So I want to turn next to really talk specifically about each of your books. And if you could just give a little bit of a summary, what the book's about, and why you decided to write that particular book. So Elaine, we'll start with you.
Elaine, your book is called From Whispers to Shouts, The Way We Talk About Cancer.
I wrote about the history of cancer awareness and why that matters. And what led me to write this book was that when I was in journalism school, I began to think about how people who are not doctors find medical information and interpret medical information. And so I grew up in a doctor's family. My dad and my uncle were in practice, and I knew something about science. And it never occurred to me at the time of my diagnosis to ask friends and neighbors, like about doctors or what kind of treatments to get. I never read magazines about cancer. I never watched TV programs about cancer. It just wasn't something I thought about. And it never occurred to me that anyone would make a decision about a cancer treatment or avoiding cancer treatment based on something they read in a magazine or that sort of thing. It just wasn't part of the way that I thought. And I began to appreciate how important are the attitudes of just the public, people, friends, people in communities, by then, people online, and how both knowingly and unknowingly, what people say and other people's experiences influence our impressions of the value of treatments or the lack of value of treatments. So if there are people who suggest, and if there are journalists who write that the treatment is worse than the disease, people will be affected by that. Not just individual people who might go for treatment or not, or go to an alternative practitioner or a conventional one or both, but also policymakers. If policymakers think that the new cancer treatments are not helpful, they're less likely to pay for those or to promote policies that will encourage payment for new cancer drugs. So the reporting about cancer, I think, is really important. And so I guess I became interested in what I call a perception gap between what my former colleagues, oncologists, were saying about cancer in the past 10 to 15 years, about how much progress there's been, and the sort of fatalism that I saw in some communities, which I think is tragic. And so I guess I decided to really do a deep dive into attitudes and why people are so negative in the face of progress and so skeptical. So that's what my book is about and why I wrote it.
And Brenda, your book is titled For My Own Good, Medical PTSD and Me.
I would like to comment first on Elaine's presentation. 8 months before I was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer, it was the time to sign up for our benefits at work again. And health benefit was, part of the employment package, but you could buy a cancer rider for that policy that would pay extra for cancer treatments. I thought about getting it, but I thought, it only pays for cut, burn, and poison. And if I ever get cancer, I am not going to use cut, burn, and poison.
Famous last words.
I'll try something more gentle and holistic and healing. I often am thankful that the kind of cancer I got was such a later stage aggressive cancer, because it really pushed my back to the wall. I had to make a decision about whether I was going to pursue alternative treatments. And I fought hard within myself. I fought so hard to try to find a reason to do alternative rather than conventional. And I knew that if I messed around trying alternative for somebody in my position, I wouldn't make it. So your book is, you're right, Elaine, exactly. My book is about the struggle that I had. I had struggles with the cancer system. My very first experience, my very first contact with the cancer clinic at the hospital was disempowering, repeatedly, over and over, no matter, that was my first experience. I was struggling with the decision, do I accept conventional treatment? I was acting like I do, but I wasn't really sure that I would. And struggling to understand what the cancer treatment was, and what all these different drugs were and how they worked, and why these drugs instead of some others that I could read about. I was trying to understand cancer and understand my strong emotions and terrors and fight a battle within myself about whether or not to accept conventional treatment. The book is about those struggles. Cancer is the setting, and the struggles are the emotional, psychological, mental health struggles that cancer and the relationships that it throws you into with other people. Those relationships, how to negotiate those relationships successfully. I did negotiate them. I wouldn't exactly call it successfully, but we got through.
One of the features I noticed about your book, Brenda, was that you were able to include actual transcripts of conversations that you had with various health providers because you had recorded those. And so I wondered if you might reflect about that. Was that helpful for you to have done that? Or was it more triggering when you went back to listen or read the transcripts?
It was very helpful. It was very helpful. I started from the very first because I had heard that, you should record your encounters with your physicians. So I said, well, this is a big encounter. I'm going to record this. I knew that I was likely to not remember or not remember accurately. And I wanted to go back and be able to listen to the recordings, or in some cases, I transcribed them and read them over and over and over again, so that I could make sense. It was empowering to me to be able to do that. I think it made my physicians a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, but it really didn't become a crisis for the hospital until my surgery. I had a mastectomy, and the surgery and the loss of control and the need to entrust yourself to people who are total strangers was like the capstone of my terror. And I talked to my surgeon twice pre-op, before, weeks before the surgery. And I said, I am terrified. I don't want to do this. This is what I would like to try to mitigate some of the most frightening things for me. And we finally agreed. There were some things that she said, no, we can't do that. And so I had to cope. I just had to suck it up and cope. But there were some things that she did not say no to. So when it came time to sign the consent forms, 2 separate sets on 2 different days, I signed the consent forms and I wrote in all of the adjustments that she and I had agreed to. So I had an audio recording of our discussion. I had 2 sets of consent forms with those terms and conditions written into them. And she violated them. And I decided not to back down. I decided to say why. There was no medical need for you to violate them. If there had been a medical need, I understand. I would expect that. But there was no medical need, and you violated them. And I had to have, in order to set my mind at ease, I had to have a couple of these conversations with her. And it was shortly after, maybe a year and a half after that, when I discovered that the hospital was informing the physicians in their practice that they did not have to allow a patient to record an encounter. And if a patient did so and the physician did not want them to, it could be considered a breach of trust on the part of the patient, and they could be dismissed.
So did you let your doctors know, though, that you were recording the conversations, right? Okay. Good. So obviously hospital systems have a vested interest in some of these things. Sometimes physicians will agree to do things privately, one-on-one with their patients. But when it comes to policies overall, things can be different. So, but thank you for sharing that, Brenda. I wanted to get back to you, Elaine, about you shared about why you wrote the book and the context of it. But if a reader is looking for a book to inform them about, let's fill in the blank here, what would be the thing that a reader can take away from your work, other than knowledge, right, or the context of where breast cancer advocacy has come from? But what were you wanting for readers to really get from your book or take away from your book?
My book highlights the importance of patients' voices. Like Brenda was saying, we all have experiences that affect us, and many of us want our experiences to matter. And I think by voicing our experiences, by sharing those, we as patients affect the direction of medical research and affect medical practice. So what Brenda was describing was a doctor basically dismissing or disregarding her request is less likely to happen now than it was 20 years ago, because there has been a lot of progress in the field of patient advocacy, and hospital systems and doctors are starting, it depends on the community, but more or less to recognize and to maybe respect at least a little bit patients' rights. So anyway, in my book, what I describe is the history of patient advocacy, in particular cancer patient advocacy. And if there's one point of my book that I'd like people to take away is that I think awareness is very important, that our capacity to speak out, to be visible, to voice our needs should not be taken for granted. And so by going through the history of that and seeing how recently it was that patients had no way to express their concerns, their complaints, their wants, their priorities, and their experiences, I think that's crucial, because first of all, there are parts of the world now where there's still a lot of stigma about cancer, where patients are hesitant to ask questions of their doctors. And even here in North America, there are communities where people still feel shame. I've interviewed, as a journalist, people who feel ashamed of having cancer. They feel that it marks their family. They feel that they're a financial burden, all of these things. And if without awareness, even more people would be feeling that way. And if people are ashamed, they're less likely to get the care that they need. And so the lesson of my book is that we shouldn't take awareness and openness about cancer for granted. And so by understanding the history of all that, I hope people will maybe be able to put their own voices into context and understand why their voices matter. I mean, the issue of trauma and stress upon being in the hospital, loss of control, is huge. I mean, I've written about that elsewhere, but, it's very scary being in the hospital. I was as a child for 5.5 weeks, and then other times for other procedures. And it's infantilizing and it's frightening. And just one practical thing that I do, like in 2002, when I had my spine surgery, and also when I had the mastectomy before that, I wrote a living will. I wrote out a New York State healthcare proxy form. I had 2 people who were not in my family witness it. I distributed that to my internist, to my oncologist, to the surgeon. I brought a copy with me to the hospital. You can't control what's done when you're unconscious, but I was afraid of losing control. And I think it's a very common and understandable and legitimate, unfortunately, fear. We can't, I don't think I have time to go into that now, but it's a very understandable feeling. And I get that.
We had a question from one of the people who are watching live. Kathleen Friel is an NBC patient. She's also a neuroscientist. She has a PhD and does research in neuroscience. But her biggest barrier to advocacy, despite her eagerness to participate in advocacy, is all the fatigue that comes as a result of years of cancer treatment. And so, Elaine, do you have some perspective on that you might be able to offer to Kathleen?
Great question. Unfortunately, for people who have let's say, serious disease or who are experiencing side effects of treatment, it's very hard to go and travel and go to meetings and represent your needs. And I know for me, well, as I go through the history of breast cancer advocacy and what I was told by Musa Mayer, who was one of the first advocates for advanced breast cancer patients, the early cancer organizations were staffed by largely women who had, for the most part, survived early stage breast cancer, which was very frustrating to people who had advanced disease, because the needs of the early stage patients were different, and the experiences, for example, mammograms that found their disease and, minimal treatments were not applicable to people with stage 4. And that division is still an issue, although it's been sort of less pronounced on the web since COVID. But, that's one of the things that led me to write my book, had to do with the anger and the divisiveness within the breast cancer community. And so I think it's really the case that if people are struggling with side effects, having to take chemo once a week, twice a week, or on drugs that make them exhausted all the time, we're just struggling from the effects of advanced disease in their bones, in their livers, in their lungs, etc. I don't need to tell this audience, it's really hard to speak for yourself. I also think that there are biases in the advocacy world and, in speaker circuits. So you find younger patients are more likely to be, selected for speakers, gigs, and people who can travel are just sort of appealing. They represent well what people want to see, which is really not fair to the people who are coping with very complicated medical regimens and side effects. Yeah.
Brenda, if we could come over to you, really, what was your intention, or what would a reader get from your book, or what was your intention for readers to get from your book?
Well, first of all, for the general public, it's just a matter of making people aware that treatment-related medical trauma, treatment-related PTSD is a thing. And I'm not alone. I'm far from alone. We have a Facebook group where we add 1 to 1.5 new people every day. I hope that if I can get physicians in training, physicians who are near retirement, and everybody in between, and nurses and technicians to read the book, they will understand what treatment-related trauma looks like and be able to possibly recognize it in their patients. When they get difficult patients, stop and think about what may have happened to them in previous medical encounters that might have affected how they're able to react now. It will not only make things easier for the patient, but it will make it easier for the treatment team as well if they understand what's going on. And for people like me, I just want you to know that you're not alone. There are a lot of us out here. We cope, we manage, we support. Over time, we grow. It's a very long process, and you're not alone, and you're not weird, and you're not bad. So understand that.
I really appreciate that, because as anybody has seen from reading your medical records, healthcare workers will use different words to describe patients. In pretty much every medical record of every doctor I've ever seen, it somewhere says that I'm difficult. And that is often a word that is used for patients who speak up. From my perspective, I have to fit cancer care into my life, not my life into cancer care. And so I don't simply show up for whatever appointment someone decides to give me. I say, I can't do that because I have to pick up my children from school. I can't do that because, my husband is traveling then. So that's the context typically of when I get described as difficult, because I am trying very hard to fit cancer into my life. So I think it's really important to remind patients that even if healthcare workers are using language that is demeaning, derogatory. Yes. That doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It does mean that you don't fit in the box that they would like you to fit into. But Brenda, would you give us kind of what is your definition of medical PTSD? I am sure people are familiar with PTSD in the context of, say, people in the military coming back from war and being very triggered by, sounds or images and things like that. But in the medical context, how does PTSD show up in the medical context?
It can be subterranean, subconscious. It can be very subconscious, as it was for me for 50 years. I just behaved weird sometimes, and I had these recurring nightmares, and I'd wake up sobbing and crying and anxious. And I just thought I was weird. I do weird things sometimes, just the way I am. When it finally emerged, I realized that it was terror and trauma that I had acquired during, like you, Elaine, childhood hospitalizations. And during cancer treatment, I became very attuned to the fact that my physicians wanted to, when I said, I am afraid of you and what you're going to do to me. I'm terrified. They weren't receptive to that. They kept wanting to say, well, don't you think you're really just afraid of the cancer? And I say, no, I'm afraid of the cancer, 100%. I'm 99% afraid of you. Cancer wins, but not by much. To me, treatment-related PTSD, medical PTSD, is post-traumatic stress that meets the DSM criteria for being truly a disorder. And it has been caused not by the shock of, or not only by the shock of a diagnosis or the trauma of being in an accident or having an injury. It has been caused by the treatments and the people delivering those treatments. They may be very necessary treatments, and they may have been done absolutely correctly, but they may still be traumatizing. They may still be experienced by the patient as a trauma. For me, medical PTSD is treatment-related medical trauma that won't stop. Every time I walk into a hospital, a clinic, have a doctor's appointment, I'm on my battlefield. A war veteran doesn't have to go back to that battlefield and fight. Every time I walk into a hospital, I'm on my battlefield. That's what medical PTSD is.
And I've tried to explain this to various people in the infusion center, right? Sitting in the chair, just walking into the infusion center. And I've tried to explain to them just this concept of I'm walking in to get this treatment, and I know that I'm going to be miserable afterwards. And I am voluntarily showing up for you to stick me with needles and give me substances that are going to make me miserable for the next couple of days. And I don't know that there is enough of acknowledgement of how much courage it takes to walk back into the battlefield, as you're talking about, to walk back into a place where is going to have a negative outcome. So I appreciate you sharing that metaphor, kind of that visualization, because I think it's important for everybody to understand and acknowledge, even in themselves, how much courage it takes to keep showing up for treatment when we know we have to get it, right? But at the same time, it's a really hard thing. So Elaine, did you have something you wanted to add there?
In my experience as an oncologist, I realized that it was very traumatic when you told people they had cancer. I mean, when I was in training, the worst thing was to tell someone they had AIDS, because at the time that was the most universally fatal thing. But I had a number of patients who had cancer, including breast cancer. And then when it came back, and also because I did blood hematology, I had patients with leukemia and with lymphoma whose cancers were in remission, and then they came back. And telling someone that their cancer was back was one of the hardest things. And especially then with metastatic breast cancer, I mean, as much as things are not great now, it was, then you were talking about a couple of months, and it was devastating to people. And I saw that secondary diagnosis was, I think, a very traumatic experience for anyone, and for the families, for the caregivers, even, I mean, this sounds self-centered, but I think for the doctors, because you as a doctor, you think, did I not give enough treatment? Did I give the wrong treatment, etc.? It's a very loaded thing when you get a diagnosis of advanced cancer or of recurrent cancer. And for someone who already had been through treatment, I'll go with a public case, if you may know from the web. And, a lot was written about a woman named Lisa Boncheck Adams, who became a friend. And, she had early stage cancer and it recurred. And, that was very traumatic, as she described it. She had been through the chemo, she had done all the stuff, and then she had to do it again. I'm choosing her case because it was so public, but we all know people like that. And I just want to say also that, we were talking earlier about the metastatic and early stage communities and advocacy and awareness. And I think because some people with metastatic breast cancer now are living longer than ever before. And, not everyone, it's not like I don't mean to minimize the condition, but people like Abigail are able to voice, are out there. And for the first time, and I'd say the past 5 to 7 years or so, I think the public has become more aware of metastatic breast cancer, stage 4. And that's really a recent change. So I just I should have said that earlier. And I think that's, in this conversation, worth mentioning.
Thank you for bringing that up. And thank you also just for reminding us that it is a human being sitting across the desk from us, right? Or sitting in that exam room with us, that doctors are not, it's the same, right? Doctors come into this experience of working with cancer patients with their own baggage and with all of the emotions that come with that. And how awful is it to have to tell people this horrible news all the time? So good reminder to be mindful of that, and to be compassionate, right? Even though sometimes that can be hard. So I wanted to shift to looking at your books individually. So Elaine, did you pick out a passage that you wanted to read to us tonight?
Sure. I chose one that's not so much about advocacy as about, I think it reflects on the book and me and progress, if you will. So it's from the start of a book of chapter 7, Cancer in the Time of AIDS. And it's about a movie, because in my book, I go through a lot of film about cancer. And so here it goes. I was 23 years old, a first-year medical student, when Terms of Endearment opened in movie theaters. Deborah Winger vibrantly portrayed Emma, a young mother with terminal cancer. You may recall, as I did over many years, the scene when she's in a hospital room saying goodbye to her sons. My eyes dampened watching, as did pretty much everyone's. The 1983 drama featured Shirley MacLaine as Emma's widowed mother, Aurora, a youthful Jeff Daniels as Emma's deadbeat husband, and Jack Nicholson as hesitant companion to Aurora, who, after her daughter's death, takes charge of raising her grandchildren. Terms of Endearment won several Oscars, including Best Picture. It avoided cliché. Emma's diagnosis arrives amid other problems in her life. Her home is broken before cancer strikes. Yet in some ways, it was the same old story. Emma dies. I'm just going to skip a bit. Midway through the film, Emma pleads for openness. Tell them it's okay to talk about the cancer, she shouts to her friend after an awkward lunch with acquaintances. In a sense, the film accomplishes Emma's wish. Terms of Endearment talks about cancer, and it's likely to have precipitated real-life discussions. I don't want to die in a hospital. Who will take care of my kids? Etc. Viewed now, Emma's plea marks how conversational norms have changed since 1983. Talking about cancer has migrated from private to public spaces. I'll say that I had 2 young sons who were the approximate ages of the boys in the movie. And my sons were that when I had breast cancer. And I had, I kept on visualizing those hospital scenes and the fact that Emma died around the time of my cancer treatment. And that sort of haunted me. It still does, really.
I love how you you brought in and wove through your book different popular culture references, like movies. You talked about Seinfeld episodes, etc. Because I think it's so great to involve things that people are listening to, watching, as well as reading, because everybody learns differently, right? I think the impact is different depending on those different modalities. So thank you for reading that, Elaine. Brenda, would you like to read a passage from your book?
The incidents that happened in my life that gave me medical PTSD happened when I was 5 years old. And there had been odd things here and there in my medical history that had kind of reinforced the PTSD and made it stronger. So the passage I'm going to read springs from that fact. There will be those who doubt that very early childhood experiences of medical treatment can leave a psychological scar like the one I suffered. They'll point out that I was not being abused, but treated medically by people trying to do good things for me, not harm me. They'll point out that I have only a few cognitive memories of the events when I was 5, and that I had lived half a lifetime and more with absolutely no emotions whatsoever, positive or negative, attached to those memories. Actually, for more than half of my life, I would have tended to agree. At the time of my 1990 surgery, however, I discovered cause to question that assessment. But afterward, strangely enough, I managed to forget again about the emotions that had just surged to the surface. For the most part, I returned to my state of not knowing. Then the emotional memories resurfaced in 2009, right after my cancer diagnosis, and the After Cancer program 10 months later helped me see that trying to block off the memory of those experiences once again was a losing proposition. I had to confront both the ancient and the recent traumas, not try to ignore them. I'm now a believer in the power of early medical experiences to traumatically shape one's life. Studies from pediatrics and the Canadian Medical Association Journal have reported on adverse events in hospitalized in the 21st century. They found astonishing rates of, quote, unintended physical injury resulting from or contributed to by medical care that required additional monitoring, treatment, or hospitalization, or that resulted in death, end quote. In 1958 and 1959, I was one of those children when a simple tonsillectomy most likely gave me a life-threatening disease. What most astonishes me about these two studies is that unintended injuries are only considered in terms of the physical harms they caused. There seems to be no awareness that all of these events in a child's life, whether planned medical interventions or terrible medical accidents, might cause psychological harm that may not be immediately obvious, but is no less real. The only group I know of that has tapped into this reality is an organization started by the parents of a child who died of cancer, the Maddie Miracle Network. From the time I realized I had PTSD, I maintained that my form of it was different than other forms because it occurred in a context not of obvious evil acts or life-threatening disasters to which I had been forced or chanced to be a party, but in a context where people were trying to do good for me, though for a small child, the element of coercion was still there. A 2019 article in the Journal of Neuroscience Research corroborated this idea. Researchers have investigated the differences in how PTSD manifests depending on what caused it. They've divided traumatic events into human-caused and natural, pointing out that human-caused trauma has, quote, different and more severe consequences, end quote, than the trauma caused by natural disasters. When you think about the difference between shit happens and you caused this shit to happen, it's easy to appreciate the distinction. What catches me up is that the article says that, quote, a large amount of research has conceptualized the various traumatic events that can produce PTSD, end quote. But it appears that precious little of that research has considered medical treatment itself as one possible cause. Doctors and nurses, if you think you're not seeing such things in your own patients, take another closer look at your most non-compliant patients, your most argumentative patients, your most difficult patients. That's me. It may be that they are, in fact, your most terrified patients, terrified and mistrustful of you, of your entire profession, and of the setting in which they find themselves. And they may have good reason for being that way that has surprisingly little to do with the specific health issue confronting them on your watch. For that matter, take another look at your most unquestioningly compliant, quiet, meek patients. Sheer terror may be lurking beneath the surface, rather than the calm understanding and reasoned consent that you think is happening.
Thank you, Brenda. I think it's so very important for all of us, whichever side of the exam table we're on, right? Whether we're sitting there or being examined, that we remember that we are human before we are patients. We are human before we are doctors. We are human before we are advocates. And there's always something beneath the surface. So thank you for sharing that, Brenda.
Since we have two authors on the podcast today, I would love to ask both Elaine and Brenda if you could enlighten us and our listeners and viewers about the publication process. I know there's so many of us out there. Once we got diagnosed with breast cancer, we start journaling, we start blogging, we start telling our story, and some of us even want to go insofar as creating and writing a book. I would love to hear what your experience has been in the publication process.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate in that I was able to connect with a very helpful agent at a literary agency. And so she sold my book, and it wound up with Columbia University Press, and I got a small advance, and that was exciting. It took me a long time to write the book for a number of reasons, mainly having to do with my own health. And it took so long that I wasn't sure I would ever finish it. And plus, the topic was constantly changing. But I think, and anyway, and then when the book sold, which was in 2017, audio books were not such a big deal, and so it was only this year that we moved. Those were separate, and my agent sold the audio rights. And that came out this month. So I'm really excited about the audiobook. I encourage people to take a listen. And the main thing is, I would say that although I went with a traditional publishing route, if you need to earn money, there's nothing wrong with self-publishing, and it may be a better way to do that. There are advantages to self-publishing, and there are advantages to having a publisher. I was very pleased. Unfortunately, the timing wasn't good when my page proofs were due. It was a hard time for me last year. My mom was in the hospital dying. But anyway, the point is that I had a good experience overall. And I just wish I would hire a publicist if you do go ahead and publish a book. That was one of the mistakes I made. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, so that we can learn from that. Elaine, as you looked at the publication landscape, there are a lot of cancer books out there, most of them being memoirs, I would think. So what made you think this is going to be something that will be different from all these other books that are out there in that particular niche?
Yeah, so the field of cancer memoirs, and particularly breast cancer memoirs, is crowded, as I wrote, and there was not much interest in there being another one when I first started writing a book proposal. That was made clear to me. The Emperor of All Maladies is the exception. In general, the topic of cancer doesn't sell. And so my book is more of a meta-narrative where I describe how stories evolved over time, and I tried to create a story of stories. And so my book differs in that way. It's not, I use my story to ground myself as a navigator and to give myself credibility, I guess, as a narrator. But I didn't want to write just my story. That wasn't my aim. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, I would say you totally succeeded in having kind of that overview of different stories, and that really set your book apart for me. So at least from my perspective, you definitely succeeded there. So Brenda, if you would speak briefly, a minute or so, about your publishing experience, which I know was a little different than Elaine's.
Yeah. My first experience publishing was way back in the late 1990s. Very different than what I went through this time. I shopped my proposal and manuscript pieces around, looking for an agent or a publisher, although mostly looking for an agent. I had a few agents tell me they really liked the story. They thought I had something important to say, but they said, well, but we can't take it right now. We're full up, or we're just about to publish a book that's, has some overlap with what you talk about. So, we can't take it here, but we encourage you to keep on looking for an agent because yours is a story that needs to be told. So I just, apparently for me, the gestation period for a book is 8 years. I had reached the end of that gestation period and this baby wanted to be born. And I just said, okay, that's it. I'm going to publish it myself. And I have indeed self-published. It is, by the way, available on Amazon.com. The title is For My Own Good, Medical PTSD and Me. There is another book on Amazon. Apparently, it has the same main title. It's a fictional book. Please do not make the mistake and think that that is mine. My book is the real story, my real story. So I've self-published, and it is surprisingly not as bad as I thought it would be in terms of complexity. Elaine, your advice about hiring a publicist, very, very, I need to do that. I agree. You're absolutely right.
Well, I didn't, and it was a mistake. Yeah.
Learning from each other is so very important in this context. So for those experiences.
Another thing I would just quickly add to this conversation about publishing is to consider possibly a ghostwriter. I know a lot of times we are dealing with so much fatigue and nausea and not feeling well, and will this book ever get written, etc. We should also explore opportunities, and if you're an aspiring writer, to partner with a ghostwriter to help you get your novel done. So that's just another avenue for publishing as well. And thank you everyone for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast are from personal experiences and are not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you're looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Until next time, keep on thriving.